Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Smallville, Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit of history of my connection to the show. So, before I get on to the teeing up and talking about the show, and then eventually all the other episodes will probably be way shorter by comparison. So, my history for this show is that eventually I went to school. Who would have thought, right? Me going to school. I ended up talking to this U.S. history teacher, and all of a sudden he was to be talking about, hey, kid, you watch a lot of, or you wear a lot of comic book shirts. Have you ever heard of a show called Smallville? And I was like, never heard of it. What is it about? All of a sudden he starts talking about that this is a show where it's like Superman before he was Superman. And I was like, okay, wow, that sounds really interesting. I'll go in and I'll check into it. I ended up starting to watch the show because it was conveniently available to me to be able to see. And then I ended up just kind of there'd be random episodes where I'd talk to the teacher about until eventually I no longer had that teacher because eventually rotating door of a number of classes and a number of things, and you just kind of forget about it. So, so later on in the life of which that I have lived, I had a number of just not so great jobs, because of course, why would they be? And so I went on to eventually doing certain overnight jobs, or I would go on and just do all these kind of crazy kind of jobs. And then eventually, after going on and getting out of those kinds of jobs, I would then eventually re-stumble upon the show by reruns. And I was like, oh, okay, wow, it's been a while since I've seen the show, but I remember enjoying it and liking it and whatever. And so eventually I was to catch the early seasons of the show. And so I was like, well, whatever happened to this show? And come to find out, it was going through its final season. I was like, oh crap. I want to go on and be able to be fully aware of what all happened with this show. So I decided to go and find every single DVD box set thing, because DVDs were the thing. And so I got every DVD box set I can find of Smallville, and luckily they were selling certain big massive sets. So I went on and I got those, and then I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna go on and watch seasons 1 through 9 and be completely caught up. And there's going to be a number of months in between before season 10 starts. So I'm going to go on and just cram like crazy watching seasons 1 through 9 so I can know everything that's going on. And then I went and was to eventually watch season 10. I couldn't go on and easily, on TV watch the show, but I would kind of figure out a way to watch it eventually later. On Amazon's and stuff, because eventually the CW apps I don't think was a thing at that time, or a thing that I didn't know existed. So yeah, so I went on and I watched these first 2 episodes, and so I really did enjoy the pilot episode, the introduction of this character. Speaking of this show, there is a number of people that are also to be covering Smallville at some point. Geekvolution has done a series called Counting Crypto Freaks, and go on and check them out. We also, of course, have Michael Rosenbaum, the guy who is to go on and play Lex Luthor, was to go and do his own YouTube channel called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. And at a lot of points, you do have a number of cast members from Smallville who go on and do interviews. But also what exists is a YouTube channel that Michael Rosenbaum and Tom Welling are doing called Talkville. and they go on and they are to talk about how they felt about the pilot episode, because that's what they just have on the channel so far. But eventually, there's going to be more content upon that channel at some point. Like, it's just the early stages of that channel because they just started to get that going. And so, with that said, all of that exists. I'll leave a link for most of the stuff that I just said about the whole Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, Talkville, and Geekvolution and stuff like that, to eventually give credit where credit's due. So, with that said, now going on into the first two episodes. So, the teeing up version of these two episodes are we to talk about, of course, Kal-El going and crash landing upon Kansas, Smallville, and having a number of kryptonite meteorites making their way also upon Kansas and creating a bunch of havoc. To then have us show the story of a young Lex Luthor and a young Lana Lang, and also a Jonathan and a Martha, who of course are kind of going throughout their day hoping for a child, and eventually by that day end they will go on and find one. So we then fast track, of course, to high school years, where it seems that Kal-El, who eventually becomes Clark, is to be dealing with the whole aftermath of Clark's crash landing, as well as a number of meteorites that had followed him here. So Clark is to deal with the burden of any time anybody is to become a meteorite freak of the week, so to speak. And so Clark is to also still be trying to understand his powers, but Clark also wants to try to be a normal kid and doesn't want to be an outcast. So he goes on and tries to desperately plead to his parents to have him play football, and he'll go on and he'll play football half speed, and Jonathan, of course, is saying no. But eventually we realize within later seasons that at some point Clark is to be his own man and make his own choices, and eventually that'll lead Clark to going on and playing football. But so, within this first episode, we go on and have some interesting moments here, where we have, of course, like, to me, like, the most interesting moment of this pilot episode is Clark just ramming his hand into the wood chipper. I thought that was pretty cool. But then not only that, we have the really interesting moment where Clark and Lana are in a graveyard, and Lana is going on and talking to her parents as if they're having a conversation with one another, and I thought that that was actually kind of interesting. Simply for me, because I'm a weird, goofy, like, supernatural character that just likes that kind of stuff. But then I also, within the second episode, could really go on and enjoy things like the Bug character that we kind of get, that is to be this kind of outcast kind of guy who goes on and, like, it seems like this character is to be very much like Peter Parker, where at first, like, he's not the most good looking guy, but it seems he's pining away for this girl, and then come to turn around after getting into an accident, it seems that this guy is to then go on and become this more good-looking guy, and all of a sudden he is to get more noticed, and then I believe Greg is to then turn around and want to get everything that he is to want, because he is to be much more powerful than he was previously. So, with that said, that's kind of the very vague way of kind of teeing up these first two episodes. So, with that said, let's just kind of go on and just kind of go into spoilers about these episodes, be a little bit more specific. Right now, this show is currently easily available on Hulu, so I probably wouldn't recommend this anywhere else. More than likely, like this show honestly should be available on HBO Max, but I guess it is what it is. So it's available on Hulu. So with that said, maybe at some point it'll switch over to HBO Max because again, that would make a lot more sense. But that's just me. So with that said, let's double fire this bad boy up because I think it's about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about the time we just spoil these episodes. So we, of course, in the very beginning of this episode, are to showcase Kal-El's ship and a number of meteorites that are making their way to Smallville, Kansas. So we, of course, have Lionel, who, of course, is played by John Glover, and we have a young Lex Luthor, who are, of course, flying via a. I think they end up flying via a helicopter, and we have Lex, who is consistently shutting his eyes the whole time, and Lionel is telling Lex, it's like, well, hey, you can't go through your life with your eyes closed. It's like, and it's kind of funny that Lionel is to go on and say that because when looking at it, Lionel eventually becomes blind. So guess who's going to be going through their life with their eyes closed? Yeah. Sadly enough, no offense to anybody who's a blind person, but it's just the weird, like, poetic thing of all this. So, we have Lex, who, of course, is to go on and look around and still be in fear. So, we have both Martha and Jonathan, who are to go on to Nell's florist shop. Weirdly, I'm just a little confused because I assumed that eventually whatever happened to the Talon, the coffee shop, because supposedly I thought Lana's family owned the Talon. Not quite sure exactly, like, if they're going to get to that yet, or they're going to save that for a number of other episodes or something like that. But from what I remember, like, Lana is eventually going to have the Talon, and that's going to be her thing, and that's always really cool. From what I remember, I think is it the Talon? People can jog my memory. It's been a while. But again, cramming all these episodes into one full swoop of a thing, you eventually somehow barely remember things. So we have a young Lana who is to be this princess, and so she's going to use this wand on Martha to give her a wish. And so we, of course, have Martha who makes this wish. And so it seems that Martha is to ask Nels for a common flower, and we of course have Nels who's asking, it's like, well, you couldn't get something more complicated than that. And they go on like, well, I'm sorry, like, she just likes common flowers. And it's like, oh, okay, that's fine. So I think Nels asked for like a tiger lily or something like that, and just like, no, just the daisies. So we have Jonathan and Martha just kind of driving off, and Jonathan immediately knows what Martha wished for, and Martha's like, yeah, I get it. I'm just very baby focused. Because, of course, they have gone on and tried to have children, but eventually just didn't happen for whatever reason. So, we are to, of course, start having meteors crash land upon Smallville. And come to find out, we have Lana's parents who are to, of course, try to make their way to Lana, and all of a sudden a meteor falls and kills them. And so we have young Lana with Nels looking on at her parents dying. And so Lana is all of a sudden crying, of course, because seeing her parents being killed. So interesting enough how they didn't go on and they didn't have Pete anywhere in this flashback. Well, I guess technically Pete yeah, I guess Pete maybe didn't live in small town or Smallville at this point. So we then go on and have Jonathan and Martha, who notice a meteor crash land, and come to find it's not really much of a meteor. It's actually a boy in the ship. And so all of a sudden they end up basically seeing this kid with really not much clothing on. And so Martha is to scoop him up and put this blanket on him. And Jonathan's like, well, hey, like a kid doesn't just fall out of the sky. There's probably going to be somebody that's going to be claiming him. And Martha's like, well, who do you think is going to be claiming him? Because, of course, they end up seeing the very small alien ship, and they're like, oh my god, this is probably what this kid came from. Oh my god. So they end up storing this alien ship away in their cellar and not their attic. So, but the car that they had, I think they ended up totaling it, and so eventually they had to get another vehicle to probably pick this ship up. So, anyways, we have Lex that is to eventually go on into this cornfield and is to spot this scarecrow looking kid called Jeremy. And eventually this meteorite ends up going on and hitting this field, and Lex is to not assist Jeremy in trying to untie him or anything. Lex just starts running for his life. So Jeremy ends up getting hit with this meteor, and then Lex is to also get some kind of blast of this meteorite also. And so Lex, when Lionel is to find him, is kind of on this ground, and most of his hair is gone from his head. So, because we have Lionel who is to pick up some of the grasp of Lex's hair, and it's going like, okay, I need to find what is left of the rest of my son. And so he then goes on to find him. So that ends up covering most of the flashbacky stuff. Now we have to go on in what is to really be Smallville current day from season 1. So we then, of course, have Clark, who is to wake up getting ready for school. And so Clark doesn't really know that he is to be much of an alien. He just knows that he has these powers. And so Clark is to go on and get ready for school. And so he ends up going on and is to ask his parents about a permission slip to go and join the football team, because Clark, of course, is very worried that if he doesn't go on and join the football team, specifically this year, then he'll go on and become possibly the scarecrow that they put out in the field. So Pete and Clark's Grandmaster scheme is to be on the football team, so that way they can avoid being the scarecrow. So Clark is to go on and talk to both Jonathan and both Martha about being on the football team. And Clark is to say, it's like, hey, like, I'll go on and I'll run half speed, and nothing will happen. And Jonathan is like, well, like I don't think that you're going to be able to control your powers just yet. Like, I think that you should kind of go on and, like, just not do that because it would be too much of a risk. So Clark is to go on and say that he doesn't want to go on and become like an outcast or a freak or whatever. Um, and that's the whole reason for him wanting to join the football team. And so Clark is to go on and go off to school where he is to accidentally miss the bus. It seems that Chloe and Pete are to go on and make a bet about whether or not that Clark would miss the bus, and unfortunately he did. Luckily, Clark is to have super speed and is to be able to just quickly make his way to school regardless. So Clark ends up going on to, I guess in this pilot episode, have a skateboard with him, which I don't really quite understand why Superman would need a skateboard. You would think that Clark would be using this skateboard so much so that he would break it because of how quickly that he would probably super speed his way using this skateboard to go to school. It doesn't make any sense to me. So Clark ends up going on to uh, go into school, and all of a sudden he stumbles and falls, and is to see Lana there, and is to have Lana start to poke at some of Clark's books. And so Clark ends up realizing that Lana has this kryptonite necklace that, of course, we find out that Nels was to give to Lana as a gift when Nels had technically adopted Lana after. So Nels was to go on and give this gift specifically to Lana because of the fact that this was to have been taken from the kryptonite that had killed her parents, and so Nels specifically made that so that way when Lana is with Nels, like, realize that, like, hey, like, yeah, this is your past, but, like, now, like, here's a gift that I'm going to give to you to kind of go on into your future. That, like, don't forget about your past, but hey, like, live in the present. So, anyways, so we all of a sudden have Whitney, who is going on and looking at Lana and looking at Clark and starting to notice that Clark looks very sickly. And so Whitney is going on and asking Clark, it's like, hey, Clark, you gonna hurl? You gonna barf? And Clark is just like, because come to find out, Clark is just very unsure about kryptonite, and I guess he hasn't been around it very often. And so eventually within these first two episodes, he starts to realize, especially in, I believe, episode 2, Clark starts to realize he has a weakness to kryptonite. And eventually it seems that also a certain number of people will also possibly figure that out also. So, moving on. So, we end up having, after this school day, we then go on to have Clark, who is to, of course, make his way to school. And we, of course, have Lex Luthor, who had gone on and is starting to work at this fertilizing plant that his father had gave him, because Lex, of course, is to go on and start working with Lionel in Luthor Corp, but Lionel is to go on and give Lex all these, like, really crappy jobs until he's to go on and eventually earn his spot. Lex has to go on and just kind of earn his spot, which is very hard because Lionel does not trust his own son, and so eventually it's going to take years or seasons of a real commitment between the two of them because of how much that they really just don't really like one another. So after Lex is to leave for his day as working at this fertilizing plant, we all of a sudden have this truck who is to go on and lose one of these uh, kind of metal things. And all of a sudden, we have Lex who is trying to grab for his cell phone and is to realize that there is this barbed wire thing in the middle of the road. So Lex tries to swerve and he ends up smashing right into Clark, as well as smashing right off of this bridge. And they both end up possibly falling to their deaths. So within this moment, we of course have on Talkville, where we have both Clark and we have both Lex, both Michael Rosenbaum and Tom Welling, who are to go on and talk about this scene on how Clark was to kind of joke around that he was to go on and do that stunt where he ends up getting hit with a car, but actually it's an obvious stunt double because they even paused it in the video. And we also have Lex, who's to mention when Clark has to go underwater to try to retrieve Lex, how like Lex was kind of, or Michael was to have this kind of a breathing apparatus and was to be in a 25-foot tank for them to like retrieve Lex. And there were certain takes where Michael was just in a panic because he was like, man, I'm probably going to lose this job just because of this one scene. And they ended up going on and doing the scene, and like Michael got more comfortable. And because, of course, like Michael was underwater, like being weighted down, and then eventually there'd be the moment where like Clark would be swimming to Lex and pulling him out of there. So it's like you gotta imagine that probably Michael had to hold his breath for a good chunk of time, with not only like there being a 25-foot like gap of air, so you really got to swim fairly quickly. So with that said, yeah, that sounds freaking wild. So we go on and we have Clark, who is to grab Lex and is to start doing CPR. And wildly, we have a number of women and maybe guys too who are just like, man, do they practice that? How many takes? Whatever. Like, when really looking at it, that shouldn't be the focus. But like, hey, like, if there is to be like kissing scenes and whatever that everybody likes to weirdly just like do a counter for. So Clark does CPR on Lex and revives him, luckily, because otherwise this would be a really short show, right? Because heaven forbid, like, we have a show without Lex Luthor, who is Michael Rosenbaum. So we have Jonathan, who arrives at the scene and is to ask, like, who is that crazy guy who went on and almost killed my son? And we have Lex, who's going on and telling Jonathan, yeah, that was me. And so Lex is to go on and say, like, hey, your son saved my life, and like, how am I ever going to repay you? And Jonathan says, dry slower. That's how you repay me. And so we go on and have really, like, consistently have Jonathan, who always just hates either Lex or Lionel, and through the seasons they have to go on and figure out why. And eventually we'll find out in later episodes that Lionel did have some ties into adoption papers for Clark. We'll find out that in much later seasons, which is kind of really cool. And eventually, somewhere down the road, you'll see that episode. It's really cool. So, but anyways, so we go on to eventually have Clark, who is to put his hand through this wood chipper, and he is to mention how, like, that is the most probably unusual thing, that he's not like a human and normal like everyone else. And like Jonathan is to try to pull Clark's arm out of this wood chipper and to find out, yeah, like he's right, like he's not the same. We also had Clark, who is to get this present from uh from Lex for saving him, and it's some truck, and Clark is to tell Jonathan about it, and Jonathan is telling Clark to just return it. And Clark is like, but I just saved Lex Luthor's life. And Jonathan's like, and you think you should get an award for that? And I thought that was like, oh my god, that is so cool. So, really, Clark is a showcase here by putting his hand in the wood chipper, that he has all these abilities, and why not like be able to use them, and because he's different from everyone else. And so we then later on have Lex, who is fencing, and Clark is going to return this gift, but we'll get to that. So we have Clark that is using his telescope that we'll see him use so many times in the early seasons, and then we'll kind of forget about it, but then in eventual later seasons we'll kind of come back to it and have people referencing like, hey, you used to come out here and you used to like spy on all your neighbors and all your people. But so we have Clark, who uses his telescope to look at Lana's house, and we have Clark who's witnessing Lana with Whitney, and he's realizing like, man, like I guess I'm never gonna go on and get Lana because Lana's always with Whitney, and they're kissing and like, so we, after that whole wood chipper incident, we have Jonathan, who goes on to give Clark some Kryptonian artifact that Jonathan was to have tried to decipher before giving this to his son, and evidently Jonathan couldn't find any of this language on Earth, so it must be alien. So Jonathan is to give this piece to Clark, hoping that maybe he'll be able to decipher it at some point, which eventually he will, because at some point Clark will eventually learn the Kryptonian language. So but of course, after we have Clark, who is talking to Jonathan, and Jonathan also shows Clark the spaceship, and is to tell him like he's an alien from outer space. Clark is to fear this, and this is all to be too much, and so he runs off. He runs off to this cemetery that conveniently Lana just so happens to be at. So Lana all of a sudden is making her way to the cemetery to want to talk to her parents, and Clark just so happens to be there, and so they end up walking together because, considering they're both here at this moment, they're going to see Lana's parents. So Lana all of a sudden starts talking and having a conversation with her parents, asking whether or not Clark is having either girl problems or boy problems. And Clark is to say no to either one. And so Lana is to try to go on and ask Clark, it's like, well, then what are you here for? Like, what are you doing? And so eventually, while Clark and Lana are to continue to talk at the cemetery, we then have Clark, who is to also talk to the spirits of Lana's parents in order to say, of course, that Lana's mother is to think that that Lana's parents will always be with her, and that his dad thinks that Lana is a shoo-in for the homecoming queen. So we have Lana asking Clark, it's like, do you really think that they said that? And Clark is like, yeah, I think that's what they said. So we then go on to have Clark, who is to meet up with Lex at his mansion. And so we have Clark that is to realize that Lex is fencing with this one girl. And Clark goes on to come into the room where Lex is throwing this this sword, and it conveniently barely misses Clark and is hit against this wall. And we have Clark who's like, well, hey, can I speak to you for a minute, Lex? And Lex is like, well, yeah, because this fencing instructor is is has gone on and really done her job today. Paraphrasing, of course. So Lex goes on and talks to Clark, and so Clark is to mention that he needs to return the truck to Lex. And so Lex is to go on and is to ask Clark if he believes a man can fly. And Clark is like, well, yeah, like on a plane he can. And Lex is like, no, like, I believe a man can actually fly. And like, I think that what Lex is really getting at is that there's a possibility that there is like an actual superhero out there, and maybe he's going to find it somehow. Maybe he believes in that so strongly. And so like that's what we get technically from the conversation, oddly, from Lex talking to Clark. And the one thing that I liked about Talkville is when they went on and said that there's a lot of writers that really like they don't understand why they wrote what they wrote, but whoever is going to have to like say these lines is going to have to make it look really good. So like something as absurd as like, Clark, have you ever known a man to fly? Yeah, on a plane. No, I mean really, like fly. And so it's like, what? What are you talking about, Lex? So we after Clark has talked to Lex, we then go on and are to eventually have Clark go on and find out who the villain is for this week. So we are to find out that a guy named Jeremy is to go on and break into the school's trophy case to go on and find this photo of these previous football players. And so we have Jeremy that goes after a guy named Frank. And so Frank the garage worker. So we have Jeremy go after this guy, and he ends up draining the electricity out of him, as if like to try to drain the electrolytes out of this person. So we start to have some unusual deaths going on into Smallville, and so we of course have that relate to the fact that people are to have gone on and seen a guy named Jeremy who should not look the way he looks, because otherwise it should be some guy who is much older, and it's not. So they then have Chloe, who goes on and is to show Clark the Wall of Weird, which is to eventually be a thing that they'll use for a number of episodes within this early season. And so I think eventually at some point Chloe does take the Wall of Weird down, simply because eventually once she becomes a freak herself, or a crypto freak herself, she eventually takes down the wall, realizing how horrible it really is. So we go on to we then go on to eventually have Clark, who after he is to leave from talking from Chloe and Pete, Clark is to then go on and get beaten up by Whitney, and Whitney is wearing, of course, Lana's necklace, the kryptonite necklace, because, of course, Whitney was to talk to Lana, and Lana was to go on and give Whitney her necklace for luck, because it seems that Whitney was to have a conversation with Lana when they were kissing before, when Clark was to see them through this telescope, and Whitney was talking about how Lana knows Nels and Nels knows the Luthers, and the Luthers, of course, know this pro football team, and so Whitney is hoping that maybe if Nels talks to the Luthers, maybe Whitney will end up on this football team, and maybe like Lana can smooth things over. And so Lana instead is to go on and be like, hey, like, how about you just go on and wear my necklace for luck, and like that'll get you to go on and not be so worried about this, because you'll have a lucky necklace. So Whitney goes on and wears this necklace, but all of a sudden is to see that Clark is to also like Lana, and eventually when Clark and Lana walk back home, after going to the cemetery, Whitney is to notice that Clark was to try to go on and talk with Lana, and that's when Whitney's like, oh, okay, he's going to be the Scarecrow this year. So Whitney then goes on and is to beat up Clark while he's doused with a kryptonite necklace near him. And so Whitney goes on and gives Clark this necklace, hence why we see this image here. And then they go on and they make him this year's Scarecrow, and they paint his chest with an S and leave him out in this cornfield. So we, of course, have the original Scarecrow guy who is to talk to Clark, and Clark is desperately asking Jeremy to save him, to untie him, and Jeremy's saying, no, like, you're going to be much more safe here than you would be where all the other people are, because eventually Jeremy's going to go after everybody. So coincidentally, we have Lex, who is to make it to this cornfield, and is to spot Jeremy, who of which that Lex remembers from his past and him going bald for the first time. And so Lex goes on to go into this cornfield searching after Jeremy, and is to find Clark instead, tied up. Lex tries to go on and untie Clark, and the necklace falls, and so Clark tries to run off to try to save his people that are at this dance. So we also had a part of this episode where Lana was to meet up with Clark, and we have Clark, who at some point is to be talking about this dance with Lana, and Lana's like, well, of course, like, I'm going with Whitney, And Clark is like, oh, okay, but like, Lana is like, well, I'll save a dance for you. And Clark is like, oh, okay, that sounds great. But it seems that uh, Lana never goes on and really does that. So we go on into this story, and so we have Lex, who goes on to save Clark, and so now Clark is running off to this dance to notice that Jeremy is trying to go on and adjust this sprinkler system to then try to kill off all of these characters. Let me pause here for a second. Okay, so Clark goes on to eventually face off with Jeremy, and so Jeremy is to tell Clark that he should stay here because Jeremy's going to go on and take and water down all these people with the sprinkler system, and then is going to go on and then take them out afterwards. And so Clark is to use his powers to stop Jeremy, and then Jeremy goes into his car. He uses his powers to electrify the car to start the car, has Jeremy go into the car, tried to run Clark over. Clark bursts through this brick wall, and so then Clark goes on to eventually notice that Jeremy is to have this car starting to fill up with water, and we accidentally have Jeremy who does himself in and starts electrifying himself, and then is to electrify himself so badly that he loses all of his memory. Clark tries to go on, pull this truck in to where he can open up this door, and this guy has no memory of who he is. And so Clark goes on and tells him, it's like, well, I'm Clark Kent, welcome to Smallville. So Jeremy, of course, to want to go home, and so Clark will allow him to do that, realizing that this guy has no memory of who he really is anymore. Cue the counter on people who is to have lost their memory at some point. Probably Whitney would probably be counting as 2 when eventually we get into the second episode. So Clark is to go, of course, back home, never going to the dance, and it seems that Lana, whether it's just a figment of Clark's imagination or this really happened, Lana then goes on as to say to Clark that he was never at this dance, so she saved the last dance for him. And so both Clark and both Lana were to go on a dance, and then Lana is to make her way to her home, and Clark is to thank Lana for saving the last dance for her. All of a sudden, we weirdly have Lana, who is to kind of turn as if she is to hear somebody, and then go back into her home. So that covers most of the first episode. So let's go on into episode 2. So we have a guy named Greg, but we also have a theme song for the show, and also a number of cast members that are to be showcasing us as they are going to be regulars upon the show. So for episode 1, they didn't have a theme song, a thing, or anything. But now that this show was picked up, all of a sudden cue the theme song. Hence probably why a number of shows never have a theme song or anything like that, because of course they're just trying to ship this show around to see if anybody's going to nibble on it, and then eventually say, yeah, we'll put some money on the show. So, but episode 2. So we have a guy named Greg, and we end up having Greg, who has a mother who is Miss Arkin, And so Arkin is to find out that Greg is to have this videotape of Lana and Whitney together, and Arkins is to be upset with Greg about, like, well, hey, like, you're going on and you're, like, following this girl, you're stalking this girl, and, like, I think I need to go on and ship you to military school. And Greg is like, no, who's going to take care of all of my bugs? Because, of course, Greg was going outside and collecting all these meteorite-looking bugs that are all to be green or to all be glowing and are very unique within this location. So Greg is to then go on and decide that he's going to take every single one of his bugs and collectively take them all and drive away. But it seems that Greg is to accidentally get into an accident which leads him to be stung or bitten by every single one of these bugs, and then all of a sudden Greg is to turn into a freak of the week for this episode. So we then go on and have Clark, who is having this dream about Lana, and all of a sudden Clark is floating above her, and Lana is saying, oh my god, Clark, you're floating. All of a sudden, Clark is to wake up from this dream floating above his bed, and Clark falls onto his bed, and his bed breaks. So we go on to have Clark telling his father about about what had happened, that he was all of a sudden floating. And so we all of a sudden have Jonathan who's telling Clark, it's like, well, like, hopefully you don't break the gravity barrier or whatever, like, or we're really going to be in trouble. So, like, hopefully Clark is going to somehow be able to maintain all of these powers. So we then transition to Lex is to start to figure out what had possibly happened to Clark, or Lex just wants to start protecting Clark, and Lex also owes Clark, and he has to figure out a way to repay him. So we go on and have this kind of food festival, or this, like, kind of food place where we have all this produce and stuff like that. So we go on, we have Greg, who is to show himself as a vastly different guy, and is to ask Lana if she can help him with this paper, this English paper, and Lana agrees. So all of a sudden Whitney is realizing that Greg is to look very different because he no longer has glasses, and of course Lana is to notice that, and that his skin is different. So Greg is just ask Whitney, it's like, well, hey, like, are you a little jealous over competition? And Whitney goes on to, like, I don't see you as competition. And so we of course have Greg that's like, well, hey, sometimes you're the windshield and sometimes you're the bug. Of course, we have all this kind of insect humor because, of course, of what Greg's technical powers are, to be similar to a bug-like power set. Spider-Man almost. So we then go on and have Clark again, or Clark and Jonathan again, who meet up with Lex, and it seems that this time around we have Jonathan who shakes the hand of Lex and walks off, and Lex is like, wow, Clark, like, your dad gave me a handshake this time around. So Lex all of a sudden starts eating this apple and is to notice Lana, and he's like, like that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna help out Clark. But then it seems that also Lex may also be working himself in also, because once we get into like the later seasons, it seems that Lex is to always be kind to Lana, and there might be some motivation behind that. We don't quite know until the later seasons. So let me scoot this up a little bit. So we go on into uh, Greg going after Whitney. So Whitney is driving away in his truck, and it seems that Greg is to be pouncing on top of the truck. And Whitney ends up getting into this car accident, and so all of a sudden it seems that the Kents uh, are slow to be behind Whitney in their vehicle. And so all of a sudden we have this moment that I think ends up getting into the opening of this show, where Clark goes on to eventually take Whitney from out of this vehicle, and then is to go on and cover up Whitney's body with Clark's own body as the truck that Whitney has explodes, and all these like parts and stuff like that are flying. And so Jonathan and Martha are checking on Clark and Whitney, and come to find Jonathan like grabs onto Clark's coat and realizes how hot it is, and he almost burns his hand. So we go on to oh, is the farmers market? My bad. So that's what I meant by the whole like the farmer thing. So the market thing. So we go on after that, and Lana is to supposedly be checking on Whitney, like behind the scenes, whatever. So we have Lex, who is making it to Lana's horse stable to talk to Lana about her current boyfriend, who is Whitney. And that's what I kind of mentioned about motives, to probably get Lana away from Whitney, to maybe either have Lana go with Clark, or to save up Lana for his own personal Lex needs. So Lex is to go on and is to mention to Lana, it's like, well, hey, do you know where your boyfriend was at between this time, the day before? Maybe you should go on and ask him about it, and you should probably ask him where his necklace is. So Lana then goes on and eventually is to confront Whitney about all this, and Whitney, of course, is to not tell her the actual truth, as Whitney, of course, to have this band-aid upon his face. So Lana is to also ask Whitney for her necklace back, and Whitney is to say that that he lost this necklace. And so Lana's like, well, when were you going to tell me about this? Or maybe you weren't ever going to tell me about this. So yeah, so we go on here, and so we have Clark that goes on to meet with Lex at his mansion, and so we see all these these model things here in this castle, and so on and so forth. And so Clark is to talk to Lex about the whole like Trojan horse story, and how like really Lionel has consistently prepared Lex by giving him books like The Art of War, and having him like know that book so well that at some point he ends up reciting that to his own father. And so Lex is to know every single thing about war, to the point of him knowing the history of the whole Trojan horse story. So we have Lex that goes on and is to give Clark this lead case with the kryptonite necklace inside, so that way Lex can give Clark this necklace. So we of course have Clark who can win over Lana with this necklace, and so that way Clark can also explain the story to Lana of what really happened to him. So eventually Lana could be won over by Clark. But so Lex gives up this necklace to Clark, and so Clark is to start to understand that he is to have a weakness to kryptonite as he puts his hand next to the kryptonite and he realizes that his hand is getting weaker. And then when Clark closes this lead case, that he's perfectly fine, to where Clark starts to realize if he's further away or behind lead, that he eventually can be safe. So Clark starts to understand that within this second episode. So let me pause here for a second. Sorry about that. So we go on here and we of course have the next scene being that so Clark has gone on to have this necklace now, and he is back at his farm, and Lana is to ask Clark about what had happened, and Clark is to now try to hide this necklace to not give this to Lana, and so Clark goes on and is to talk to Lana about what had happened, but because eventually Lana's to know about it, so Clark has to be honest about it. So after that moment of Clark talking to Lana, eventually Clark is to notice that Jonathan is working on some farm equipment, and so Clark is like, hey, I'll help you, Dad, and Jonathan's like, well, that sounds really great. So eventually Clark tries to want to help Jonathan with some equipment, and since Greg is to start to realize that Clark had saved Whitney, and it seems that also Clark is going to eventually be spending all of his time with Lana, Greg is to now want to go after Clark to stop Clark from probably rescuing so many people, because it's becoming like the town joke already that Clark has saved so many people already. And when Lex meets him into this episode, when they talk about the Trojan horse, Lex is to make the joke about like, well, hey, like, have you gone on and saved anybody before you got here? Like, you should probably make a job out of that. And Clark is like, I don't know. So we then go on and have Jonathan trying to help, or Clark trying to help Jonathan with some repairs, and all of a sudden we have Clark notice Greg in the rafters of this barn. So both Jonathan and Clark get their flashlights on to see what this is. All of a sudden we go on to have Jonathan get attacked by Greg, and so Clark uses his super speed to protect Jonathan from, of course, getting killed here. And so Jonathan is now laying on top of Clark, who is to kind of get the brunt of whatever he is to be kind of laying on. And so Jonathan is technically saved. And so eventually when they go on to check out what that was, eventually it's gone. And so now we just see this kind of weird green trail of these footprints upon this wall to just be like, okay, whatever this is something very unusual. And for this town, like, because we go on, we have Clark take it personally that maybe Greg becoming this character is to probably be from all the meteorites, and we have Jonathan who is telling Clark that no, like, it's probably from that fertilizer plant that the Lionels are going on and putting together, because I'm sure they're probably creating a number of freaks themselves. So we then go on and have Clark starting to ask Chloe about Greg, and Chloe was to mention that at one point Greg was a reporter for them at the Torch, or was it? I don't know if they have an actual official name, but it seems that um, like the guy didn't go on and put out uh, many of these kind of things. Uh, so she worked with him in the past, but like she didn't know much about him. So uh, we then go on and have also like Clark and Pete are to know Greg, because of course they used to be friends with one another, but they had like a falling out. Um, and so Pete, Clark, and Greg used to go to this one wood fort when they were young, but for some reason they just had a falling out between the three of them. So they all go to Greg's house, and come to find out, they realize that Greg is starting to shed his skin and is starting to molt, and eventually is going to go on and try to find a mate. Because, of course, when Greg goes on and attacks his mother, that's what Greg tells his mother is what steps he's going to go on and do. So, when they all go into Greg's house, they see the husk or the shell of what formerly was Greg's mother inside this house, as well as they see a video being played with Lana in it, and they're like, well, I guess he's picked his mate. So Greg's room is to be full of webs and so on and so forth, and so they're starting to realize what is going to be the next step here. So we go on and have Greg, who is to find Lana and is to again ask about the whole English paper thing. And Lana's like, yeah, I think I can go on and help you out. I think they ended up talking about before about them going to the library, because that seems to be the rational place to help somebody with a paper, but it just never pans out. So Greg goes to Lana's horse stable to ask about the helping out of that paper again. And so Whitney ends up coming in there to try and break this all up. And Greg goes on and is to kind of chuck Whitney, and then takes Lana and then goes off to try and run off. So Clark is to go on and find Whitney at the stable. And so Clark tells Whitney to go to this old tree fort, and Clark then vanishes because he uses his super speed to quickly get to Greg. So we then have Clark, who fights off with Greg, and Clark ends up using lead to kind of his advantage, because there is a number of spots within the place where Greg is fighting with Clark that there is some kryptonite. So Clark goes on to start fighting Greg, and Greg is to mention how there's certain insect abilities that he, of course, is to have. That is to have, like him to be able to have, like, 30 times the strength of which that he has, that can fling Clark around. So, but eventually we go on and have Clark, who is to try and take down Greg here. And eventually what happens instead is that Clark ends up going on and finding out, or ends up going on and seeing that Whitney is to rescue Lana, and Whitney becomes the hero of the day, and Greg ends up disappearing after the fight with Clark to never really get to see him again until much later in the show, where Greg reunites with Clark when they do the whole reunion show, where Clark is talking with God, what is his name? I know it's like Bio something. Or Brainiac, yeah. Brainiac. Brainiac comes back to show Clark his life, and is to find out the guy ends up coming back in the later season to thank Clark for like showing him the way by like rescuing him from what he was about to do. This guy was to change who he was to be a different person. And so we get to see him later down the road. So we go on, and we of course have Clark by the end of this episode, who goes on and is to take this necklace from out of this metal casing and puts it on Lana's door, and is to knock on the door and then speeds off. And so Lana is to find this necklace on her door. I'm like, oh, like somebody must have given this to me, and it probably wasn't Clark. It's probably Whitney. That's what eventually I'm sure Lana assumed. So, with that said, that covers most of the 2 episodes. I apologize about how I didn't like actually showcase what happened to Greg and whatever, but with that said, that covers most of this episode. Let me know in the comments below if there's something that I did forget about. I apologize how long this episode was, but I covered 2 episodes, and there's a lot that kind of goes on, especially with the pilot. And then eventually, once we get further into these episodes, it might be easier to break these down. I'm not going to promise that, but at the end of the day, I'm just going to say that I think it's about that time to just get out of here. It's kind of interesting to have reviewed these episodes because I didn't realize how complicated the show was, how like it doesn't seem like an easy flow of everything. So I was like, okay, like I wish there was a easier flow to it all, but anyways, it is what it is. Because we have so many like cut into these kind of like scenes between these characters where I'm just like, okay, like this is gonna be weird to break this all down. So with that said, hopefully we'll go on and figure things out when we get into further reviews and so on and so forth. I think for the most point, I went on to mostly remember everyone's characters' names. Eventually, when we get into later seasons and more complex characters and whatever, and regular characters end up showcasing themselves upon the show, I'm going to have to figure out who all they were at some point. So there's that for you. I'm going to get the heck out of here so I can go on and call this one a shorter review than me just gabbing on and on about. I like this show. I liked it. It's just, regardless how and plus also it's like really hard to grade this early thing because it's definitely going to be positive for me. Like really, if I were to go on here, I would probably have to go on and critique that some episode may be a filler, or certain episodes may be like crappy or whatever. I really liked the storyline with Alicia in it, the teleporting girl. That was probably my favorite storyline of this whole series. I loved that the most, so I really enjoyed that. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.